The mountains of North Korea stood like jagged teeth against a gray, dying sky. It was November 1950, and the world was beginning to freeze completely solid. 10,000 Marines moved deep into the valley, unaware of the coming storm. The air held a crystalline stillness that felt more like a warning than peace. Sergeant Miller adjusted his heavy parka, sensing a change in the thin mountain air. High above, the Siberian winds began their long, predatory descent into the deep valley. The temperature did not just drop, it plummeted like a stone into the abyss. Within hours, the mercury hit zero, then kept falling toward the unthinkable 40 below. In this environment, the very chemistry of survival began to change for every man. The Marines noticed the change first in the sound of their own footsteps. The soft crunch of autumn snow was replaced by a sharp, metallic snapping sound. Every breath felt like inhaling 1,000 tiny needles made of liquid nitrogen ice. Moisture in the nostrils froze instantly, making every inhalation a painful, stinging struggle. Sergeant Miller watched as the steam from his coffee turned to ice before drinking. The heat was being sucked out of their bodies by an invisible, hungering force. This was not just weather. It was a physical assault on the human spirit. In the distance, the reservoir groaned as the ice thickened to several feet deep. The sound echoed through the mountains like the roar of a distant, angry god. By twilight, the sun offered no warmth, only a pale, sickly light over the ice. The first night at 40 below was about to begin for the trapped men. As darkness settled, the Marines reached for their weapons, only to find them changed. The heavy steel had become so cold it would tear skin upon the slightest contact. Metal contracted in the deep freeze, seizing up the tight tolerances of the machinery. The standard-issue lubricating oil had the consistency of thick, black molasses at this temperature. Sergeant Miller pulled the charging handle of his rifle, but it refused to move. He hammered at the steel with his palm, desperate to break the icy seal. Across the perimeter, the sound of metal striking metal rang out in the night. If a rifle did fire, the recoil often shattered the frozen wooden stocks. The weapons of modern war were being rendered useless by the ancient power of ice. Machine guns were even more vulnerable, their complex cooling systems long since frozen solid. Men began to realize they were holding nothing but very expensive, very cold clubs. To keep the guns working, soldiers began to use their own bodies for warmth. They slept with their rifles inside their sleeping bags to prevent the oil from seizing. Every piece of gear was failing, from the smallest watch to the largest truck. Vehicle engines became iron statues, their fuel lines choked with frozen condensation. If an engine was shut off for more than a few minutes, it was lost. Marines kept the trucks running 24 hours a day, a desperate mechanical heartbeat. But even the fuel was beginning to change, turning cloudy and sluggish in the tanks. Without transportation, the Marines would be trapped in the mountains forever. They were a modern army being stripped of their technology by the Arctic wind. As the machines failed, the human body became the next battlefield for the cold. Blood is the body's internal furnace, but at 40 below, that furnace struggles. The brain begins to prioritize the core, abandoning the fingers and the toes. This is the beginning of frostbite, a painless and terrifying loss of self. Nerve endings die in the silence, leaving the soldier unaware of his own destruction. Many men did not realize they were freezing until they tried to stand up. Sergeant Miller watched as a fellow Marine removed a boot, only to see skin come with it. In this environment, a simple wound became a guaranteed death sentence. Blood thickened and refused to clot, while plasma bags turned into blocks of ice. Medics were forced to carry morphine syringes inside their mouths to keep them liquid. If the morphine froze, it could not be injected, leaving the wounded in agony. The screams of the injured were often the only sound in the frozen mountain passes. Men began to shiver so violently that they could no longer hold their positions. Shivering is the body's last-ditch effort to create heat through rapid friction. Once the shivering stops, the core temperature begins its final, fatal decline. The brain, starved of warmth, begins to hallucinate a strange and deadly heat. Some men began to strip off their clothes, believing they were burning up. This paradoxical undressing was the final sign that the cold had won. Sergeant Miller patrolled the line, constantly kicking men to keep them awake. To sleep was to die. The cold was a predator that only attacked the still. The Marines were becoming part of the landscape, statues of ice in green parkas. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. Even their sweat was dangerous, freezing inside their boots and turning to ice. Every fluid in the human body was trying to turn into a solid, jagged crystal. The cold was not just outside them. It was now moving through their veins. Across the reservoir, the Chinese army was suffering an even more horrific fate. They had no cold weather gear, no sleeping bags, and often, no shoes. Entire platoons were found frozen in their foxholes, still holding their rifles. They were ghost soldiers, preserved in the exact moment of their final, freezing breath. The Chosin Reservoir was becoming a massive, open-air tomb for two great armies. But for those still breathing, the hardest part of the journey was yet to come. The silence of the reservoir was suddenly shattered by the eerie wail of bugles. Thousands of Chinese soldiers emerged from the shadows like ghosts from the frozen earth. Mortar flares hissed into the sky, casting a sickly green light over the ice. Sergeant Miller gripped his rifle, the frozen steel biting through his heavy wool gloves. The flashes of gunfire were the only warmth in a world of absolute zero. But even the gunpowder behaved differently in the extreme and heavy Arctic air. The cold made the smoke linger, creating a thick, choking fog across the line. Men fought in a daze, their movements slowed by the weight of frozen clothing. Every drop of sweat inside their parkas turned into a layer of jagged ice. To stop moving was to become a permanent part of the Korean mountain range. By the third day, the Marines were running dangerously low on vital mortar ammunition. Radio operators shouted the code name for 60mm rounds into their frozen handsets. They called for Tootsie rolls, a secret name known only to the supply officers. But in the chaos of the rear command, the code was tragically misunderstood. Instead of explosives, the transport planes loaded thousands of boxes of actual chocolate. The crates tumbled through the freezing sky, dangling from small, white silk parachutes. The Marines watched in disbelief as the crates smashed into the deep, hard snow. Sergeant Miller pried one open, finding only frozen bars of hard, brown chocolate. The chocolate was frozen so solid it could chip a man's teeth like stone. But soon, they realized this mistake was actually a life-saving miracle in disguise. The sugar provided a quick burst of energy that their freezing bodies desperately needed. Softened in the mouth, the chocolate became the only food they could actually swallow. The error became a legend, a story of survival written in cocoa and ice. Digging a foxhole in the Chosin Valley was like trying to shovel solid granite. The frost line reached deep into the ground, turning the soil into iron. Standard shovels snapped in half, their wooden handles brittle from the sub-zero air. Marines were forced to use C for explosives just to create a small fighting hole. The blast threw chunks of frozen earth into the air like lethal shards of shrapnel. Even after a blast, the hole was often too shallow to provide real cover. Men used the frozen bodies of the fallen as makeshift sandbags for protection. It was a grim necessity in a land where the living and dead looked identical. Sergeant Miller spent the hours of darkness simply trying to keep his blood moving. To stay still for more than 10 minutes was to invite the sleep of death. On the eastern side of the reservoir, Task Force Faith was being systematically destroyed. Surrounded and cut off, they fought a desperate battle against overwhelming odds. The cold was their primary jailer, preventing any hope of a quick escape. Many wounded men froze to death in the backs of trucks while waiting for help. Their stories were often lost in the whiteout conditions of the mountain passes. Sergeant Miller heard the distant thunder of their struggle echoing across the ice. He knew that if the perimeter broke, they would all share the same fate. Inside the aid stations, the air was only slightly warmer than the blizzard outside. Medics worked by the light of flickering lanterns, their own hands numb and blue. Standard antiseptic was useless, freezing solid as soon as the bottle was opened. They used the heat of their armpits to thaw the morphine needed for surgery. The wounded were kept together in heaps, using collective body heat to stay alive. It was a primitive struggle for survival in a world of advanced military technology. Every man saved was a victory against both the enemy and the elements. But the elements were gaining ground with every hour that passed in the dark. On December 6th, The order was given to begin the final breakout attempt. General Smith famously declared they were not retreating, but attacking in another direction. The road was a narrow, icy ribbon winding through vertical cliffs and deep chasms. Marines walked beside their trucks, ready to push them should the engines fail. Sergeant Miller took his place in the column, his eyes fixed on the man ahead. They moved at the speed of a crawl, hampered by wreckage and hidden ambushes. The Chinese army waited in the heights, firing down from the frozen peaks. The Marines had to clear every ridge before the trucks could move forward safely. It was a battle fought in vertical space, where the cold was the constant victor. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the cliff to keep the road clear. The valley floor was littered with the debris of a modern army in retreat. The most terrifying obstacle lay at Funchalen Pass, where a bridge had been destroyed. Without this bridge, 10,000 men and their equipment would be trapped forever. The Marines called for an impossible solution: a bridge dropped from the clouds. 8 massive steel sections were attached to giant parachutes and released into the storm. Engineers watched with bated breath as the steel plummeted toward the icy rocks. One section was lost to the wind, but the remaining parts were recovered. Under heavy fire and sub-zero wind, the engineers began the impossible assembly. Their hands stuck to the metal, but they refused to stop for the cold. Slowly, the gap was closed with a temporary path of steel and courage. The first truck crossed tentatively, the steel groaning under the weight and ice. The lifeline was open. The Marines were finally moving toward the sea. Beyond the bridge, the road became a gauntlet of ice and hidden snipers. Men were so exhausted they began to hallucinate in the shimmering white landscape. Sergeant Miller saw phantom cities rising from the frozen mist of the valley. Sleep was a gravity that pulled at their eyelids with a heavy, lethal force. To sit down for a moment of rest was to invite a permanent slumber. The cold was now a physical weight, pressing down on every aching, frozen muscle. Footfalls no longer made sound. The world had gone completely and terrifyingly silent. Even the wind seemed to have frozen in place among the jagged mountain peaks. They were no longer an army. They were a column of moving ice statues. Sergeant Miller's rifle was now a part of his body, frozen to his gloves. Science tells us that at these temperatures, the human heart begins to slow. The blood becomes a thick slurry, struggling to move through the narrowest vessels. This is when the mind begins its final, strange descent into a deadly warmth. Paradoxical warmth trickles through the nerves, convincing the victim that they are burning. In reality, the core temperature is failing, and the end is only minutes away. Sergeant Miller fought the urge to unbutton his coat, biting his tongue for pain. Pain was the only proof of life remaining in the -40-degree air. Every nerve ending was screaming, a chorus of agony that kept him moving forward. To lose the pain was to lose the war against the North Korean winter. The cold was an indifferent god, demanding total submission from everyone it touched. On the 12th day, the air began to change, carrying a hint of salt. The biting mountain wind was being replaced by a heavy, damp coastal fog. Below them, the port of Hungnam waited, a final sanctuary on the edge of the world. Thousands of refugees had already gathered there, fleeing the advancing Chinese army. The Marines descended the final hills, their boots finally hitting the slushy coastal mud. The sound of the sea was a roar that drowned out the mountain bugles. Naval destroyers sat in the harbor, their massive guns provide a protective wall of steel. The thunder of the big guns echoed through the valley, holding the enemy at bay. Sergeant Miller reached the perimeter of the port, collapsing against a stack of crates. He was alive, but the cold had taken parts of him he could never replace. One ship, a merchant vessel called the Meredith Victory, would perform the impossible. Designed to carry 47 men, it would soon hold 14,000 souls. There was no food, no water, and no heat for the 3-day journey south. The refugees stood in total silence, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. 5 babies were born during that journey, a flicker of life in a world of ice. Back on the pier, the engineers prepared to destroy everything that was left behind. Millions of tons of supplies and ammunition were rigged with high explosives. The goal was to leave the enemy nothing but a smoking, frozen wasteland. The final Marine stepped onto the last landing craft as the timers hit 0. The explosion that followed was the largest non-nuclear blast in history. The shockwave shattered the ice for miles around the burning city. A mushroom cloud of black soot and fire rose 3,000 feet into the sky. The Marines watched from the decks of the ships, their faces illuminated by the blast. For the first time in weeks, they felt the warmth of fire on their skin. But the heat was fleeting, and the cold sea soon reclaimed the air. They reached South Korea, but the war for their bodies had only just begun. Doctors struggled to treat injuries the likes of which they had never seen. Gangrene and rot were the lingering gifts of the Chosin Reservoir. Thousands of men would live the rest of their lives with the Chosin limp. The cold had left permanent scars on their nerves and their memories. Even decades later, they could still feel the phantom bite of the mountain wind. They became known as the Chosin Few, a brotherhood forged in the 0-degree dark. Their story is one of survival against an enemy that could not be bargained with. Nature does not take sides. It only tests the limits of the human heart. And at Chosin, the human heart proved to be the only thing that wouldn't freeze. Today, the reservoir is a place of silence, hidden deep within North Korea. But for the families of the fallen, it remains a hallowed, icy ground. The lessons learned in that valley changed the way armies prepare for the winter. New materials and new science were born from the tragedy of the 1950s. We now know how to fight the cold, but we can never truly defeat it. The Arctic wind is a patient hunter, always waiting for the heat to fail. To remember the Chosin Few is to remember the cost of every warm breath. It is a story that begins and ends with the endurance of the human spirit. While the world moved on, the mountains of Korea kept their frozen secrets. The reservoir remains a mirror, reflecting the sky and the ghosts of the past. The enemy you couldn't shoot is still out there, waiting in the shadows. It is the cold that waits at the end of all things, the final silence. But even in the dark, we carry the fire of those who came before. Their courage is the warmth that protects us from the coming winter. For the Chosin Few, the march is finally over, and the home is warm. While the main body moved, one small company held a vital mountain pass. Fox Hill was a frozen rock that commanded the only road to safety. For 5 nights, 200 men fought off thousands in the sub-zero dark. They had no heat, no hot food, and almost no hope of rescue. Captain Barber walked the line, his own wounds hidden beneath layers of ice. He knew that if Fox Hill fell, the entire division would be lost. The men used frozen Chinese bodies as barricades against the relentless North Korean wind. They were fighting in a world where the living and dead looked identical. On the final night, the ammunition was gone, and the bayonets came out. The defense of Fox Hill remains one of the greatest stands in military history. Above the mountains, the pilots of the 1st Marine Air Wing fought the weather. Cockpits were unheated, and the plexiglass often frosted over in the thin air. Engines struggled to breathe in the oxygen-starved heights of the North Korean peaks. To the Marines on the ground, the sound of gull-wing Corsairs was salvation. Pilots flew so low their propellers kicked up the snow of the valley floor. They dropped napalm to create walls of fire that provided the only heat. For a few minutes, the freezing men could finally feel their own blood moving. But the fire died quickly, and the Arctic cold reclaimed the scorched earth. Aviation history was being written in the ice-filled skies above the reservoir. Every flight was a gamble against the engine's ability to stay warm. The C-119 Flying Boxcar was the only machine capable of carrying the bridge. Engineers worked in the cargo bays, securing the steel sections with heavy chains. Each section weighed 2 tons, a lethal weight if the parachutes failed. The pilots had to fly at stall speed to ensure an accurate drop. When the signal came, the steel vanished into the white abyss of the storm. The physics of the drop were calculated by hand in sub-zero conditions. It was the first time in history a bridge had been air-delivered to an army. The survival of 15,000 men depended on these cold, gray slabs of steel. Not all snow at Chosin was the same. The men learned the differences. Corn snow acted like ball bearings, making the steep roads even more lethal. The crust snow could support a man's weight until it suddenly shattered. Below the snow lay the black ice, an invisible layer of frozen groundwater. This ice was so hard it could chip the steel blades of the bulldozers. The terrain was an alien world, made of water but harder than stone. Amidst the machines, one animal became a hero of the mountain war. Reckless the horse carried ammunition when the trucks could no longer climb. She learned to crawl behind cover when the sound of incoming mortars began. She was a creature of the cold, her thick coat protecting her from the wind. Reckless made dozens of trips alone, guided only by the smell of home. She survived the reservoir, becoming the only animal to ever hold military rank. The cold changed the way sound moved through the mountain valleys. Sounds traveled for miles, amplified by the hard, reflective surface of the ice. The thud of a distant mortar sounded like a hammer against a drum. Metal against metal rang with a high, piercing frequency that never seemed to fade. The most terrifying sound was the absolute silence of a massive snowfall. It was a white silence that could drive a man to the edge of madness. Lieutenant Thomas Hudner looked down from his plane and saw a brother in trouble. Jesse Brown, the Navy's first black carrier pilot, was trapped in his cockpit. Hudner did the unthinkable. He crashed his own plane to try and save him. He worked in the snow with bare hands, trying to free his friend from the metal. But the cold was faster than the man, and the metal would not let go. Jesse Brown died in that valley, a hero preserved forever in the Chosin ice. Hudner was awarded the Medal of Honor for an act of courage that failed. To the Marines, lava was the name for the only hot food they ever saw. It was a mix of everything they had, boiled into a life-sustaining sludge. The heat of the food was more important than the taste or the texture. Once finished, the bowl would freeze solid in less than 3 minutes. Fuel for the body was as critical as fuel for the trucks and the tanks. Calories were burned at triple the normal rate just to maintain a pulse. On the final night, the temperature dropped to its lowest recorded point. The stars were so bright they seemed to vibrate in the thin, frozen air. Sergeant Miller looked up and felt the true scale of the world's indifference. He was a speck of heat in a universe that wanted to be absolute zero. He realized that survival was not a victory, but a temporary stay of execution. He stood up, his joints popping like small pistol shots in the silence. The column was moving again, a river of shadows flowing toward the sea. They were leaving the reservoir, but they were taking the cold with them. The ice of Chosin had entered their souls, never to be fully thawed. The reservoir was behind them, but the war for their lives would never end. They had survived the white hell, but they would always be the frozen Chosin. The ships pulled away, leaving the frozen shoreline to the advancing shadows of winter. Below decks, the heat of the engines felt like a strange and alien miracle. Men simply stared at their hands, watching the frost melt into dirty, gray water. The silence on the ships was heavy, a shared weight of survival and loss. Doctors had to learn new ways to rewarm tissue without causing further cellular damage. Many discovered that the damage of the reservoir was deeper than the skin itself. The Chosin limp became a recognizable mark of those who survived the frozen north. Even in the warmth of the south, they could still feel the mountain wind. They were returning to a world that could not imagine the white hell. Sergeant Miller looked at the horizon, wondering if he would ever truly feel warm. Back home, the veterans of Chosin found that the cold followed them into sleep. In quiet American suburbs, men still woke up screaming from the phantom mountain wind. They didn't talk about the reservoir. The words felt too cold to ever speak. PTSD was not yet a name, but the Chosin chill was a known reality. For some, the only way to cope was to find the others who were there. They formed a brotherhood of the ice, a bond that required no explanation. They were the keepers of a story that the rest of the world forgot. History books called it a police action, but to them, it was a war. The cold was a witness that could never be cross-examined or truly silenced. It lived in their bones, a permanent reminder of the limits of human endurance. The tragedy of Chosin led to a total revolution in military winter gear. Scientists studied the Tootsie roll miracle to understand the role of quick glucose. We now understand how the body shunts blood to protect the internal core. Modern Mickey Mouse boots were designed based on the failures of 1950. Every piece of gear used by mountain troops today is a debt to Chosin. We have learned to fight the freeze, but we still respect its power. This silent killer is now a subject of study instead of a mystery. But data cannot capture the sheer terror of a night at 40 below. Science provides the how, but the Marines of Chosin provided the why. They proved that technology is nothing without the will to stay alive. Decades later, a few survivors returned to the hills they once defended. The reservoir was still there, a blue jewel hidden in the forbidden north. The silence was no longer heavy with war, but with a deep peace. They left flowers in the snow, a tribute to the friends they left behind. The mountain bugles were replaced by the soft whistling of the wind. The earth had reclaimed the iron, but it could not reclaim the memory. Sergeant Miller stood on the shore, finally feeling the sun on his face. He realized that the reservoir was no longer his enemy, but his witness. He took a breath of the thin air and felt no pain, only gratitude. The frozen Chosin had finally come home, even if only in their hearts. Nature is not cruel. It is simply indifferent to the struggles of man. It does not choose sides in our wars. It only sets the stage. The cold is a constant, a reminder of the universe's true temperature. We are the fire, a brief and beautiful flicker in the dark of time. To survive is to keep that fire burning against the coming of the night. The Marines at Chosin kept the fire alive when the world tried to freeze it. They showed us that the heart can be warmer than the coldest mountain wind. Their legacy is a testament to the fact that we are never truly defeated. As long as we remember, the cold will never truly win the war. For the enemy you couldn't shoot has a rival it can never kill: memory. The story of Chosin is a story of what happens when man meets the limit. It is a story of courage that was frozen in time, but never forgotten. We tell it so that the heat of their struggle might warm our own lives. We tell it so that we never forget the price of a single warm breath. The reservoir is silent now, but the mountains still echo with their names. Every snowflake that falls there is a prayer for the ones who stayed. They are the frozen Chosin, and their march will continue as long as we speak. They are the heroes of the Zero, the warriors of the White Hell. Sergeant Miller and the thousands like him have earned their final rest. The enemy is gone, the guns are silent, and the world is finally warm. But if you listen closely to the winter wind, you can still hear them. You can hear the crunch of the ice and the wail of the bugles. You can hear the heartbeat of an army that refused to die in the dark. Their story is our history, and their courage is our light. The reservoir is a mirror, and today, it reflects a world of peace. Sleep well, the frozen Chosin, for your march has reached its end. The fire you carried will never go out, as long as we remember. Good night to the mountains, the ice, and the heroes of the reservoir. The cold has passed, and the light has finally, truly won the war. This has been the story of the enemy you couldn't shoot. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.